August 27th, 1994 should have been a proud moment for the National Wrestling Alliance. It was the day that they were set to crown a new world champion. Their own world champion, following the separation of the Alliance from WCW. Crowning a new champion was an exciting prospect for the NWA, with its top title no longer under WCW's control as it had been. It also signified the return of the most famous design of the NWA World title, as WCW had replaced it with what is today known as the Big Gold Belt. A one-night tournament was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in one of the Alliance's biggest territories, Eastern Championship Wrestling, including some impressive names of the day, like the Tasmaniac, Dean Malenko, and Doink the Clown for some reason. The final of the tournament saw two more up-and-coming stars vie for the gold, with Shane Douglas, the former Dynamic Dude, defeating Too Cold Scorpio to win the championship. But what happened next, the NWA hadn't bargained for, as Shane took the microphone, presumably to give his victory speech. I stand here before God and my Father in heaven tonight, as I said I would be, World's Heavyweight Champion. In the tradition of Lou Thez, in the tradition of Jack Briscoe, of the Briscoe brothers, not those ones, of Dory Funk Jr., of Terry Funk, of the real Nature Boy Buddy Rogers upstairs tonight. From the Harley Racers to the Barry Windhams to the Ric Flairs. I accept this heavyweight title. Of Kerry Von Erich, of the Fat Man himself Dusty Rhodes. This is it tonight, Dad. And Rick Steamboat. And they can all kiss my ass. With that line, Shane would take his newly won World Championship, whose lineage could be traced back to 1948, and he would throw it to the ground. Shane goes on to declare the NWA to be a dead promotion, proclaiming himself the new ECW World Champion. Why did Shane do this? Whose idea was it? And what would be the consequences for Eastern Championship Wrestling? According to Shane Douglas in a 2018 interview, the whole idea came from ECW founder Todd Gordon and booker Paul Heyman, who had been part of creative in ECW for almost a year by this point. Shane was already ECW's champion at the time, having beaten Terry Funk for the title in March of '94. So the plan was made, since ECW was one of the largest and best drawing NWA territories at the time, to crown the ECW champion the NWA World Champion also. In the 2005 WWE-produced documentary The Rise and Fall of ECW, Paul Heyman claims that he pitched the idea as a way of breaking Eastern Championship Wrestling away from the traditional perception of wrestling upheld by the NWA. In Paul's words, the old-school NWA was everything we wanted to get away from. In that documentary, Paul doesn't mention a man who's very important to this story, who Paul and Todd Gordon had heat with at the time, a fellow promoter and competitor who he claimed in a 2006 interview would call the fire department on ECW shows claiming overcrowding, just to be a nuisance. Dennis Coraluzzo. The tournament final and Shane's actions afterwards would air on the August 30th episode of Eastern Championship Wrestling, and would be followed by an interview with, at the time, joint NWA president, who was in the building that night, Coraluzzo. Dennis was a fellow promoter in the Philadelphia and New Jersey area, and had made clear his distaste for Todd Gordon and ECW because of its mature product. Even before ECW became Extreme by name, they had already begun the shift towards its new direction. Dennis also was against ECW hosting the title tournament, but was overruled by the NWA board, as ECW was one of the few Alliance members with a stable television presence. Therefore, it would give the new champion more exposure. At the time, Dennis was understandably shocked by what he saw in the ring, but he was assured by Todd and Paul that this was just a storyline to start an NWA vs ECW feud. Neither side, Dennis on one and Paul and Todd on the other, trusted each other's intentions for the NWA World title. So Paul and Todd planned the swerve to distance themselves from the NWA, to create buzz for their new brand, and to firmly define Shane Douglas as their guy. Having won the NWA World title in the tournament, their regional champion was now able to rebrand himself as a world champion in the eyes of ECW's fans. On the Hardcore TV episode, moments after Douglas's actions were aired, Coraluzzo, who at this point still wasn't aware that he'd been swerved, claimed on camera that Shane was still the NWA World Champion, and the NWA board would get involved since ECW was one of their members. Little did he know that at the time these comments would play directly into Todd and Paul's hands, as this interview would be directly followed by a message from Todd Gordon himself, announcing that NWA Eastern Championship Wrestling as a company was being folded, and in its place would be Extreme Championship Wrestling. Not an NWA member, so not subject to its rules. The show would close with the Public Enemy, one of ECW's hottest tag teams of the day, spray painting over the word Eastern on the logo banner and painting the word Extreme under it. While the name Hardcore TV had existed since April of the previous year, the following week's show, aired on September 6, 1994, would be the first episode of Extreme Championship Wrestling. In the interview with Shane Douglas I referenced earlier, he noted that he initially felt that the idea, when pitched to him by Paul Heyman, was the wrong thing to do. In the promo where he won the title, he listed many esteemed names who had also held that honour, who he did have respect for. Well, most of them. For those not in the know, Shane has had a long-time grudge against Ric Flair for his treatment in WCW while Flair was booking the shows, a grudge that he's referenced for decades now. He claimed to spend the whole week leading up to the event wrestling with the idea of it, and notes that Paul never forced him to do it. He claims that his mind was made up after receiving a phone call from, of all people, Mike Tenay, the future voice of TNA Wrestling, who at the time hosted a radio show called Wrestling Insiders. Tenay told Douglas that on his show the previous night, Dennis Coraluzzo had made some negative comments about him. When Shane heard the comments from a man Shane didn't really even know, he was incensed, and this was enough to convince him to follow Heyman's plan. Dennis, again, not knowing what he had started, unwittingly caused a great deal of damage to the NWA, damage that it would take a long time for the alliance to come back from. In November, he would oversee another tournament to crown a new NWA World Champion, having stripped Shane of the title. This time, held in association with Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Jim has stated that given his former ties to the NWA and respect for it, he was appalled when he learned what had happened. Jim has had a fairly rocky history with Paul Heyman, and this no doubt made things worse between them. Cornette has claimed that while not an official NWA member, he offered to host a new tournament to crown a champion, one Cornette trusted in future ECW star Chris Candido. Unfortunately for the NWA, the bloom was already off the rose, and the NWA would struggle through the rest of the 1990s. There would be a few notable names to hold the title over the next 8 years, such as Sabu, Steve Corino, both ECW names, and former UFC champion Dan Severn, who in his first reign held the title for 4 years and a month. After some dark years for the title, where it usually changed hands on non-televised events, often heard about through word of mouth, it wouldn't be until NWA TNA launched in June of 2002 that the title would be seen by a national and eventually global audience as TNA grew. While the NWA entered its wilderness years for the rest of the 90s, ECW would continue to thrive. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.